Hello everyone, and welcome to Week 8's video lecture on contentious conflict. You will have completed the Viking negotiation, and now we are moving towards a theoretical review of some of the concepts that fall out of this negotiation and are reviewed in your textbook. So let's start by talking about conflict and how conflict is dealt with within a negotiation. The Viking negotiation itself is a great place to start because the Viking negotiation has built in a disagreement, some misunderstandings between the two parties. So one party believes one thing, the other party believes another. Under these conditions, there are different ways to frame a discussion. There are different ways a discussion can follow through. So here are some of the important things to note. There are three types of things that we can talk about in Viking, three different places where we can focus our energy and our efforts. We can think about these as three different ways to resolve disputes or three different ways to talk through an issue. But in this particular negotiation, you could spend all of your time talking about the interests of the two parties, the rights, or we could talk about power, right? So each person within this negotiation has a set of interests, a set of a claim that they make in terms of their own rights, and they have power. And each of these, we can spend our time circulating or discussing the issues within this negotiation from any of these viewpoints. Now, think about your own negotiation process. Did you spend most of your time focused on the contract? So who was right according to the letter of the law? Did you spend most of your time focused on what is right, what is equitable, what is fair? If you did, you were in the center of the circle and you were focused mainly on rights and responsibilities, either what's morally right or what's contractually right. Or perhaps you spent a lot of time talking about the enforcement of the contract versus declaring bankruptcy. So leveraging your power base within this negotiation. Coming from a place of more resources, or coming from a place where you have this kind of veto wild card where you can say, well, I'll just declare bankruptcy and you'll get nothing. So that's another place where you could have spent a lot of time. Or perhaps you spent a lot of time talking about your interests. One party wanting to do business to be able to continue to make investments and to grow their business. Another to wanting to stay in business and keep their employees employed. If you had done that, you would have stayed in a place of interests rather. So within this negotiation, you'll see that each party, the interests of Pat are money for future investment. The interest for Sandy is to avoid bankruptcy. The rights that Pat views are these contractual rights. Sandy's rights are based in moral authority. Power is based on the contract versus bankruptcy. So depending on where you spent your time, the tone of the negotiation would be quite different. So when people are focused on interests, we see collaborative and cooperative negotiations. When people are focused on rights, we often see highly conflictual negotiations. And when people use their power base, we often again see increased conflict within negotiations. So keep in mind that the approach that you use in terms of the discussion will color the way in which the discussion will move forward. So think in terms of making a decision about where to focus and center your negotiations, there are things to take into consideration. Sometimes there are transaction costs to following one route versus another. So what is the cost to me of sticking to a rights-based frame? There are also, you want to consider what will be the satisfaction with the outcome. So depend if I were to stick to a rights-based frame, enforcing the contract, will this lead me to an outcome that I will be happy with, or will this lead both parties to an outcome that we can be happy with? What will be the impact on our relationship? Is our relationship important? If this is something that you'd like to protect, you'll want to consider that in terms of the approach that you use to resolve the dispute. You'll also want to consider likelihood of recurrence. How likely is it that you'll be in this situation again? And what are the tones that you can set now to make sure that you're able to deal with these types of things more easily in the future? So consider the cost, the social cost, the outcome cost of taking one approach versus another, an interest or rights or a power-based approach. Now, I'm sure that you can kind of feel that the interest-based approach is often the most useful approach, because the interest-based approach is the one that will help you to fulfill your needs, protect the relationship, and move you to an outcome that is collaborative, not compromising. I want to make sure that that's clear. It's not about making compromises. It's about collaborating and being creative about the types of resolutions that you come to, having lots of possibilities on the table instead of being really narrowly focused around, say, a contract, for example. But what happens if you're at a table and you have somebody who is focused on a power-based set of arguments, or perhaps a rights-based set of arguments? And how do you get that person to then switch over and focus on interests? Well, here are some tips and clues on how to do that. The first is, don't reciprocate a power or rights-based statement. If somebody says, well, I'll just enforce the contract, then you don't say, well, then I'll just declare bankruptcy. Try and offer an interest-based alternative, an interest-based statement to move us forward. Right? So you could enforce the contract. I hear you. That's within your rights. But at the same time, perhaps we can come up with another way that you can continue to invest your in future opportunities, that we can get you to the place where that will work. Another important tip is, don't get personal. Make sure that you don't spend time insulting other people, or in this case, for example, Sandy might call Pat negligent for going on vacation. That's a very personal statement, and you wouldn't want to get personal within a negotiation, especially if you're trying to orient it towards an interest-based discussion. You might choose to reciprocate, but to couple your statement with an interest-based proposal. So as I had given you the example earlier, that Pat might say, I'm going to enforce the contract. Sandy's response might be, you could enforce the contract. If you were to do so, I would have to declare bankruptcy. That's reciprocating. So that's taking a rights-based argument, reciprocating with a rights-based argument, and then offering a way forward. But if we were to do that, we wouldn't get very far. It's not in either of our best interests. So can we find a way to help me avoid bankruptcy and to help you continue your business, your investment business? Right? You might also try a process intervention. When people are fixated on rights and power, often these tend to be circular arguments. It's often only one argument that you're circling around. So it ends up, instead of having more things to say, people end up getting very frustrated very quickly, sometimes even raising their voice and saying the same thing repeatedly. So instead of fixating on these rights-based arguments and power-based arguments, and fixating on the arguments themselves, you might try a process intervention. This is where, instead of yelling, where you might say something like, hey, I know this is a really frustrating situation, but this yelling or this line of arguments is not getting us anywhere. Could we consider, taking 5 minutes? Could we consider regrouping? Could we consider discussing something else? So you might try to intervene in the process. These are some ways to get rights or power-based negotiators back to interests. But I don't want to be naive about this whole thing. I want to be quite clear that there are times to use rights and power-based arguments. And here are some of those important times to note. There are times when the other party will not come to the negotiating table. There are times where the other party will not cooperate. They're not willing to negotiate with you. At that moment, you do have to leverage your rights or power-based position. You might have to use your rights or power-based position when you're at an impasse and every attempt that you've made to focus on interests just isn't working. You've exhausted all efforts and it's time to now just get the job done. You may have to flex your rights or power-based position. Finally, when negotiations are moving towards their end point, when you know you've already created a lot of value and now it's time to claim that value, you're in the distributive phase of your negotiation, you might turn to a right or power-based argument to make sure that you get a part of the pie that is reasonable for your position, for whatever you bring to the table. These are some times where you might use a rights or power-based argument. There's always risk when using rights and power, often these, or when dealing with conflict. Often these are situations where they're highly contentious. There's a great deal of opportunity for emotion, a great deal of opportunity for fixation on given arguments that will not get us very far. There's also a great deal of opportunity for fixation on personal arguments. So there can be times where it's important for you to look outside of your own negotiating skills and get an agent. And your textbook talks a great deal about this. When we're looking at times of high conflict, these are times when it might be important to think about getting an agent. Here are some other times where you might think about getting an agent. You might think about an agent when you need technical advice. For example, a lawyer, a real estate agent, and if you need special market knowledge. Investments, you might need a financial advisor. So these are times, or insurance, you might need an insurance broker to broker the sale, because there's also an economy of scale issue there. They can get better prices because they buy in bigger quantities. So there are times where you'll need some sort of technical support. There might also be times where there's special negotiation skills required. So for an example, I can think of the example of a talent, so a sports person or a musician who might need an agent because the type of negotiation that is required is beyond their skill. It's about contracts and requires a special set of skills that they themselves don't possess. You might also think about getting an agent if you yourself are too emotionally involved. I often tell the story in class about the time that I bought my house, and when I bought the house that I'm currently living in, my real estate agent was with me when I first saw the house, and it became, although we had seen 8 houses in the same day in an attempt to increase our BATNA, when we saw this particular house, it was quite clear to me that this was the house that I desperately wanted. And because of that, because I knew that I wanted this house so much and that I was willing to pay for that a little bit more because of that desire for the house, I knew that there was a potential that I would leave value on the table. So I made it clear to my real estate agent that this was the house that I wanted, but I did step back a little bit from the negotiations in order to make sure that I wasn't paying too much. You might also get an agent when your time is more valuable than that of your representative. So there might, and hopefully there is, a time in your life when you are doing such important work, or you're doing so many negotiations, or there's so much going on, that there are things that you yourself don't need to take care of, and you can get somebody else to take care of those types of negotiations for you, right? What are your options when you're thinking about a third party? Your textbook goes into a little bit more detail about some of the variations under these categories, well, when it comes to agents, there are lots of options, but when you're talking about conflict resolution, you have third-party options for resolving the conflict. And I'm sure you've heard about these before, especially in your HR classes that have to do with collective bargaining. But third-party, if you're at a level of conflict that can't be resolved, you have options for resolving that conflict that are not necessarily as rigid as legal outcomes. So the first is arbitration. In arbitration, there is a third party that both members will agree on. So we both choose, and Emily Thornton to be our arbitrator, and we agree that once we've made our arguments and developed our case, and we've presented all the facts to this individual, she or he will take control of shaping and determining an outcome. He or she will determine what the best outcome is for us. Binding arbitration means that we agree to the outcome before we've even seen it. So you might choose arbitration when you're thinking that somebody else might be able to see a resolution that you can't see. Somebody else can be more objective about the various facts in the case. If you both agree to the arbitrator and it's somebody that you both trust and respect, then you'll be able to put a little bit of stock into the outcome that they propose and think, well, if this is the way they see it, then maybe there's some merit to that. All right, so arbitration is one way. Mediation is another third-party option for resolving conflict. And this works very well when two parties are still committed to coming to a resolution together, but are having trouble figuring out what that resolution might be. In mediation, the third party works with both parties to create a solution. So it's not the situation where they listen to all of the arguments and develop a solution for the two parties. It's where they listen to both parties, and through discussion with both parties, create a solution that both parties then agree to through some sort of cooperative process. Okay. Now, before we finish off, let's take a moment to talk. So we've talked so far about conflict and negotiations, about resolving conflict, about using external parties such as agents or third parties, mediators, arbitrators. Let's talk for a moment about difficult negotiations themselves, and some of the things that you might see within a difficult negotiation that you have to respond to. The first thing that you might have to respond to, maybe you had to respond to this in Viking, was responding to hardball tactics. What do you do? We have talked at great length in the class and in some of your textbook work around what a hardball tactic looks like. So we've talked about chicken, and we've talked about flinching. Now, how do you respond to these? Here are 4 options that are outlined in your textbook that we can explore a little bit here. The first option is that you might call them on it. You might say, look, I see what you're doing there, and I think I'd like to move away from those types of tactics. So you might call them on it. You might just name it. And that naming of it might let them know that you're not as naive as they think you are. It might let them know that you're not going to stand for things like that. There's a bit of a risk with this, of course, because it could the person could then play up being offended, could play up some sort of other response. You might ignore them, so you might try and ignore it and move on. The risk here is that, of course, that they'll just keep trying to use them. You might respond in kind. So that we talked about this with regards to anchoring. If somebody sets an anchor, you set a counter anchor. You might use the same tactic back on them. The risk with this, of course, is that it could spiral and we could just end up using a series of tactics on one another and not really get to a place where we're coming to reasonable and helpful resolutions. You might, instead of just calling them on it, you might offer a more productive way to get through it. This is akin to the idea earlier of offering a process intervention. So instead of dealing with the tactic, say, I think that we need to figure out another way to move forward, and then offering some suggestions on how to do so. I also want to point out how you might respond to people with high levels of power within your negotiation. If you were to go into this negotiation, Viking, I bet those of you who were in Sandy's role felt that you were at great risk, that you were in a position of low power, given that you owed a great deal of money to Pat. In any case, it actually turns out you have a fair amount of power because of the bankruptcy issue. But if you have to respond to somebody who does have high power because of things like a contract or high resources or any such thing, you might find different ways of dealing with that. The first might be that you protect yourself from that power. The second would be that you improve your BATNA, and we've talked about this throughout the class, that you make sure that you have alternatives that exist outside of that particular negotiation that are meaningful to you and useful to you. You want to make sure that you know your threshold. This is the importance of a resistance point. Knowing at which point you can walk away. This information, holding on to that, knowing at what point you are willing to leave the negotiating table, reminds you not to be swayed by the power that the other person holds. You might redistribute the power and correct the imbalance. This would happen in a cooperative negotiation where the other party might decide to redistribute how things are laid out, or how you might come to an agreement about sharing resources or sharing different indicators of power within a negotiation. All right, and we'll come to that a little bit more as we move through the course. The last thing I want to touch on today is dealing with an impasse. Now, we've had a few impasses in the class so far. This is where we cannot come to a deal. What do we do in situations like this? Did you come to an impasse in the Viking negotiation agreement? It's actually quite easy to come to an impasse in this one because there are such contentious issues. Sometimes all you need to do when you're in this situation is to take a step back. Take a step back from the negotiation and kind of observe it from the outside. And think about, well, how else could I come into this negotiation? What other ways could I approach this negotiation? That might give you some creative problem solving or some creative ways forward that can help to jar the negotiation and move it forward. You'll also want to listen carefully. If you are having trouble moving forward with the negotiation, it can be useful to make sure that the other person feels they are being heard, and to also use the information they are giving you to help move the negotiation forward. Are there things that they are saying that you can help to satisfy, that you can agree to, that you can create small levels of agreement or small wins out of? You might also consider reframing the problem. So in the Viking investment negotiation, the problem appears at the surface to be this contract. And you could spend all day discussing the contract, and it's not clear there's a solution that can be drawn that's based on the contract. The contract ends up being an important source of power, certainly, but at the same time, it's not clear whether there was actually a breach of contract. It's not clear whether Fawn is an agent or is not an agent, or what a judge would find in a court of law. So it's actually unclear how the power of the contract, the power that this contract actually holds. So in order to move forward, you need to reframe the problem. The problem is not dealing with the contract. The problem is dealing with the issues that both parties bring to the table. One being that this work has been done, that needs to be paid for. The level of pay is still under debate, and that both parties have interests that need to be met. So reframing the problem as, can we resolve how we are going to come to terms with or make agreements on this particular deal, and a way forward is a way of reframing the problem. All right. That is your online lecture for Viking investments. Next week, for this particular negotiation, you will read chapters 8 and 11, and you'll prepare Bullard houses for our next class. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in class soon. Take care.